We are back, and we are joined now by Brett Christophers, professor in the Institute for Housing and Urban Research at Sweden's Uppsala University. I hope I didn't butcher that. And the author of The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. Brett, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me on.
So, I wasn't expecting this when I picked up your book, because you don't typically see people who have a background in consulting have any kind of regard for the planet. I don't mean to be over the top about it, but we've talked about consultants on this show before, and how they can be these hired guns for corporations to cut costs. But how did your background as a management consultant inform your research and your I guess your work on this topic?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. You're right that I spent around 8 years in management strategy consulting, which was a while back, and ever since then I've been an academic. And actually, while it didn't take me long in that world to realize that world wasn't ultimately for me. It was an incredibly valuable period, and actually, I would argue that. Many of the most important things I learned about capitalism and the way capitalism works, I learned from when I was a consultant, being kind of, so to speak, within the belly of the beast. I learned a heck of a lot more then than I have done in a way subsequently, looking at capitalism from the outside as a kind of external analyst. Being part of it on a day-to-day basis was incredibly instructive, even if not ultimately for me as a career.
What were some of those instructive pieces? I mean, what did you take away from that time?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it, to be honest, was really sort of basic stuff, but the sort of stuff that many people working outside of that world just don't know. Just really basics like reading company balance sheets and understanding how capitalist businesses work on a day-to-day basis and what kind of things work and what kind of thing doesn't. I mean, it sounds very mundane and very banal, but actually incredibly important. And I've carried that with me through all of my career. And as I say, it sounds very basic, but I actually think it's quite fundamental.
That's throughout your book. I mean, it's inherent to it. It serves also as a bit of a myth buster about what motivates capital investment, right? I mean, it's
yeah, absolutely.
There's this romantic notion of these upstart businesses. If you have a good idea, I mean, you're going to get some investment and someone's going to see it, and then you can grow it into this large business. But renewable energies are good ideas. Renewable energies have shown a lot of promise. And your book talks about how the perception of what the incentives are for investment in that, it's not exactly true, a lot of what people assume.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think that, put it this way, there are many people and institutions and companies out there that are, often for the best reasons imaginable, are keen to develop new renewable energy facilities, new solar farms and wind farms and so on. But the reality is that for every, let's say for every 100 ideas for projects that are out there, only a handful ever proceed to development. Now, there's a very common conception out there that the biggest obstacle for those developments that don't ultimately make it is because they don't get planning permission, they don't get the permits they need, they don't get the grid connection and so on. But the reality is that in most cases, the obstacle is that those entities are not able to raise the financing they need to proceed. And that's because back of those developers, there are hard-nosed financial institutions that look at those project proposals and they say, well, you've got a great idea here, but the reality is that the renewable electricity business is an incredibly volatile business most of the time. Profitability is pretty thin most of the time. And so while we might, salute your objectives here, the reality is that we're not convinced that you'll be able to pay back the money that we need to loan you to get the development off the ground. And as I say, and that takes me all the way back to that work in consulting, whereas it's exactly that kind of hard-nosed financial viability analysis that is undertaken on a day-to-day basis that really is at the root of contemporary capitalism.
And so, I mean, it's the root of it too is just in the same way that a lot of other industries work, right? Where people are trying to invest or get returns that are sure things, and that they're trying to make sure that their boss doesn't get mad at them, or that they're able to make as much money as possible, as opposed to, as I said earlier, this kind of romantic notion of investing in this exciting technology. Can you contrast like what an investment in a traditional energy source would look like for somebody's portfolio versus, you know, taking a risk on some of these renewable energies that don't necessarily have that consistent profit or the fatter returns that would draw people in?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that one of the contrasts that I like to draw, because I think it's a contrast that a lot of people can relate to, and it's obviously a very important contrast, would be between kind of the traditional oil and gas business. On the one hand, the business of the likes of Chevron and Exxon and so on, and the business of renewable energy development, so developing solar and wind farms and selling the electricity that they generate on the other hand. Now, the former of those is, at least in recent years, for quite a consistent period of time now, has been a very high return business. You know, typically those companies don't get out of bed and don't even consider proceeding with projects if they don't think they're going to be able to get returns of at least 15% on those types of projects. Whereas in the renewable energy world, you're lucky if you get 6, 7, 8% returns. So it's a much lower profit business. Now, in underlying terms, both of them are volatile, but one of the things that you find in the oil and gas business that you don't find in the renewables business is that they're over a considerable period of time, they have developed various institutional structures, institutional mechanisms to try to mitigate that volatility. And so the best example of that would be OPEC, right? OPEC is nothing if not a price fixing cartel. And if there's any concern in the global oil market that prices are going down, OPEC calls a halt to production in certain parts of the OPEC world and asks for production quotas to be railed back. And so there are these mechanisms that exist to maintain pricing and profits when they are threatened. Now, the renewable electricity world is a completely different world in most parts of the world, where those sorts of mechanisms don't exist. It's an incredibly competitive world. Generating companies are selling their electricity into incredibly competitive wholesale markets for the buying and selling of electricity. And so those mechanisms for the mitigation of volatility don't exist to anything like the same extent. And that scares off investors. Investors like to see predictability of returns and of profits. And in the renewables world, those forms of predictability and stability are quite hard to find. They do exist, but they tend to be provided by governments rather than by within market mechanisms, so to speak.
And I mean, it almost the OPEC example is such a great one, right? Because it's basically capital reaching a certain threshold, and where you get to a certain level of power, where then there's colluding and price fixing that can go on, and it's accepted, but then it reinforces itself, because then there's that built-in stability just by the amount of money that we're talking about here, and the fact that those players can throw their weight around, that it congeals, right? I mean, it's almost as if, right? Go on.
It does, and and the thing that it does, I think, that's probably most important, is that it provides continuing incentives for investment in that sector, right? If prospective developers of new oil and gas resources can see that the price volatility in oil markets has reduced over time because of the efficacy of institutions like OPEC, then it's very easy for them to take the decisions to make that investment. But in a sector where that confidence and that predictability doesn't exist, then it's much harder for the necessary financing to be raised. And I think that and I think that's where you are in the renewables market globally, is that you're in a situation now where not least with interest rates having gone up and with supply chain costs having gone up, there is a great degree of hesitancy amongst financial institutions in particular to provide the financing that renewables developers require in order to proceed with those developments. And I think that's precisely why you see things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is a situation where over time, the level of the tax credits that the US government had been providing to wind and solar developers had been going down over time. There was generally a confidence in government that you could kind of wean the industry off those subsidies because of declining technology costs and all the rest of it. But what happened as those subsidies got reduced was that investment began to stagnate. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act, more than anything else, was a recognition that the industry, at least right now, can't do without significant levels of support and subsidy because of that volatility and because of the lack of confidence in financial institutions to support that industry in the absence of those subsidy mechanisms.
And so it does basically, even though the Inflation Reduction Act is a pro-capitalist bill, it's about spurring investment by giving these tax credits. It hasn't created the desired effect based on what you're saying, which means perhaps a heavier state hand would be more appropriate to speed this along, given the severity of what we're seeing.
Well, let's put it this way. I think it's too early still to make a call on the efficacy of the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, it didn't come into force and obviously until late in 2022. We're still early in 2024. And I think the data to tell whether it's had the desired effect that remains to be seen. I think one of the other things worth saying, just to your point, is absolutely it's a pro-capitalist act. I mean, it is about providing confidence in the desired level of profitability in order for investment to go ahead. Is that a good or a bad thing? Well, it depends on where you're coming from. I mean, if you were to ask me, look, if the choice is between, on the one hand, renewable energy development proceeding very, very rapidly and lots of big firms making lots of profits off the back of that development, on the one hand, or on the other hand, the necessary levels of profitability not being available and capitalists not therefore investing and therefore renewable energy development not occurring at speed and at scale, then I would take the first option every time. But of course, in the wider political economic scheme of things, those are not the only two choices. We live in a world where in most parts of the world, including the US, the energy transition has essentially been outsourced to the private sector and to markets. Governments have essentially said, look, we expect you, the private sector, to do this, to take the lead. Our role will be one of providing incentives and nudges and support mechanisms as and where we think they are necessary to enable you to do your job. But that's not the only world of possibilities, right? The government could do other things. It could, theoretically at least, become much more active in actually proceeding with renewable energy development itself, financing, investing, operating those sorts of resources on its own terms, rather than simply relying on incentivizing the private sector. So I think there are wider possibilities out there. The extent to which those are credible in the current political economic environment is another question.
Certainly. But I mean, it occurs to me that we have these utilities that could be a great place to start where state hands, it might not necessarily fly in the face or cause Fox News to scream communism at the top of their lungs or something to that effect. Like, there could be tweaks within the quasi-public utility sectors that I feel haven't necessarily been explored. And I know you touch on this a bit.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that many viewers won't necessarily be aware of is the fact that even within the US, there are huge differences in how the electricity sector is organized geographically across the country. So in some parts of the country, the classic utility model that you're referring to doesn't really exist anymore. So the classic utility would be a situation where one entity within a particular geographical area owns the whole electricity supply chain. So they generate the electricity, they own the infrastructure through which that electricity is transmitted and distributed, and they sell the electricity to households. There are some parts of the country in which that model still exists. The Southeast is probably the best example of that, so including Florida. But there are large parts of the country where that model has been swept away, and where instead of that, you have kind of a separate generation sector. So you have independent production companies that generate the electricity, and then you have other entities that distribute it, and other entities still that sell it to consumers. And Texas, California, New England are very good examples of that. And I think you're right that the traditional utility model, in a way, offers options that are different and potentially preferable to the kind of disaggregated model that the country has been moving towards. If you are a utility company that owns the whole supply chain, then in a way you have a much more coordinated business. You can align what's going on in the generation sector with what's going on in distribution and retail in a way that isn't really possible when you have these autonomous actors that are controlling different parts of the supply chain. But here's the thing, right, which is that in those parts of the country where the utilities still exist, they have their own conventional power plants that have traditionally applied those that have supplied the electricity, whether that's coal or natural gas-fired plants or both of them. The cost involved in those are sunk costs. They've already experienced those costs. So they have an interest in exploiting those existing generating assets until the end of their useful life, rather than potentially investing in new generating resources. And so there are arguments, both positive and negative, for both of those models, if you see what I mean, both for the traditional utility model, but also for the newer separate generating sector model.
Yes, I mean, and I think that's in part due to the very disjointed nature of it here in the United States that you describe. There have been the Texas electricity model, and its very privatized model, is notorious, at least on this program, for its inefficiencies and its gouging and all of that. But I guess then the kind of final question here to wrap things up is how can we incentivize or push governments to act and with the urgency that would be necessary to combat climate change, outside of trying to get investors, markets to move in their direction? Because the prospect of just the cheapness of the electricity, of renewable energy, is not moving things, right? So
no. I mean that's right. I mean, the argument at the core of the book is the fact that it has become increasingly cheap to generate electricity through solar and wind resources is not enough economically if actors are not incentivized to invest in the development of those resources in the first place. And there are significant problems around those incentives, not least relating to the points about volatility that we talked about earlier. It's not only about volatility, but volatility is a key part of that. So that, as you say, that raises the question of what can be done about it, and in particular, what governments can do. I mean, I think there are three broad answers to that question. And you tend to hear those answers from three different constituencies. So the answer that you get from kind of mainstream energy economists, what they say is that the problem is not that we're relying on the private sector and markets. They would argue that the problem is that we haven't got the market design right. So they would say, look, the problem, we need to stick with reliance on the private sector and markets, but we just need to tinker with the way in which electricity is bought and sold. We need to change the incentive mechanisms. We need to change the so-called merit order model through which electricity is priced in wholesale markets. And if we get the market design right, everything else will flow from that. I'm incredibly skeptical of that argument, because that's the classic kind of neoliberal argument, which is that the answer to problems created by marketization is not something other than markets. It's simply more markets, or better markets. It's the classic neoliberal argument for which there's no fundamental evidence at all. So that's the first answer. The second answer, which is the answer you hear from industry, and which is the one you've alluded to, is which is they say, look, we need to stick with exactly the existing model, where governments are there to support industry and subsidize industry. And we can stick with exactly the same market design we have at the moment. We just need more subsidy. That's essentially that's what's happened with the Inflation Reduction Act. Government has responded to industry concerns that the subsidies are not sufficient to drive development of renewables at the pace we need. That's the second answer. The third answer is that actually the problem is with relying on private sector and markets. And as far as I see it, a larger government role, including government investment in and ownership of renewable resources on a much larger scale than either exists at the moment or is being contemplated, would be one possibility for that. Now, the answer you will get from opponents of that idea is, no, governments are operating under huge fiscal constraints. They have to be fiscally conservative. Governments need to tighten their belts. Well, the reality is that the public sector, not least in the US, is still able to borrow more cheaply than the private sector is. And it's not like it would be borrowing to invest in resources that aren't revenue generating. It would be borrowing to invest in resources that are revenue generating. They might not be profitable enough to attract private investment, but you would hope and imagine that the public sector would be willing to invest in resources where the returns are only 5% or so, if the private sector isn't willing to do that. So I think there is an argument for that type of public sector role, which frankly was right at the heart of the Green New Deal proposals, as they were originally articulated both in the US and in the UK. So I think there is an alternative there, but those would be the kind of three broad answers that are out there at the moment.
The book is really fascinating. It's called The Price is Wrong: Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. Brett Christophers, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.